For those who are coming in, you can use the Meet Echo from the phone by scanning in the barcode outside. I find that it works easiest if you're on your laptop to just use the Meet Echo from your browser. So I think, should we get started? I think with that, we can get started. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, can those on the remote hear me okay? Okay, we're good.
Nancy, this is Roman speaking. You're loud and clear.
Excellent. Thank you, Roman, as are you. Okay, so welcome to the IETF for you. For some of you, it may be your first physical. Those who are on site, I think, Tim, right? No, I can't see from here. Patrick. So welcome. This is the Scim, otherwise known System for Cross Domain or Cloud Identity Management working group. With me now, I have a co-chair. Welcome him, Aaron Korecki. So, rules of engagement. I don't know why I'm trying to flip slides. Who is here for the first time? For those on site, I'm presuming those that are in remote. I'm looking at the remote, may have already joined. So in the IETF, we follow some procedures that are noted in the note well. In the interest of time, I will not go through each of them. I encourage you to read them. Next slide, please. We also have some online meeting tips. We used to have blue sheets, but since this is hybrid, it's mainly taken off the Meet Echo attendance. So this is where I encourage you, if you want your attendance recorded, to get into Meet Echo. And there is a chat room too that you can get to through the little bubble chat in the Meet Echo, or you can use Jabber. Next slide, please. And we also have a code of conduct, which is basically treat everyone with respect. You're here to be an active participant and welcome the participation to this group. All right. One more note, since this is our first hybrid meeting and there are rules that the IETF is trying to follow, please make sure that all of those that are here on site, please make sure you're wearing your masks because it is mandatory. Okay? Okay, with that, we can go ahead and get started with the agenda bash. I believe we have a couple of volunteers already for the minute takers. So thank you, Ned. I forget who the second one is, Pam, but you're kind of partial since you're covering the first one. And so I encourage, I put the link here where the minutes are being taken, which is in a HackMD HedgeDoc link. I encourage everyone to review those as well, because those are our recorded minutes. Next slide. Okay, so on to the agenda. On our charter, the first things off the gate is for us to update the use cases, the protocol, and the base protocol and schema. And we have assigned editors for them, so I've asked them to provide updates and progress on those. We actually have Elliot also, who is focusing on IoT. He will be speaking to the use cases and applicability of Scim for IoT. And then Phil has posted a draft on how Scim is a profile that can be shared using the shared signals and events. So if he needs my help, I will step down and Aaron can take over chairing to help him present a little bit of background about shared signals and events, otherwise fondly known as SSE. But he will be presenting the Scim profiles for that. So that is the agenda, unless anybody has any changes or comments. It is the agenda bash time. Going once, going twice. All right, so with that, I will have Pam come up. And I, of course, let me bring up, unless you want to share.
Are you able to, if you could share, great, if not, I can.
I had it.
I put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Pam Dingle from Microsoft. If you look in the chat in MeetEcho, there's a HackMD link there that is basically an outline bash for the use cases and concepts document. So my hope is today in this time, we go through that, we confirm whether this is in general the right thing and whether there's missing pieces, and people, please feel free to add to this. Better if you don't delete, but if you do think something should be deleted, type it in the text, and that way we'll cover that. So just a little bit of background. If for any of you who are not aware, and many people are not, the RFC series for Scim is actually 3 documents, not 2. So there's a specification called RFC 7642, which is meant to be an overview use cases and concepts. However, in the working group process in that last effort, that document really served a different purpose, at least as I understood it. I wasn't part of that, so I don't want to speak for that group. But it helped to form what went into the protocol, into 7643 and 7644, but it didn't get updated at the end. And so the document doesn't cover all of the concepts that we believe an implementer might need to know in order to come in and understand the specification and be able to implement to it. So the goal here, at least as I understand it, is to describe, the existing RFCs in an updated internet draft, or an updated draft that is closer to the actual concepts that that are modern today, so that we could have implementers more easily understand the specification. So let me just check before I go further. Does that make sense to everyone? Is there anyone who wants to comment on the goal? All right, you're always welcome to add more or contact us after, of course, or post to the list. So here's.
Hold on, Pam.
Oh, you've got a hand
Leif
up?
is on the queue.
Oh,
Yep.
sorry, quick question. Leif Johansson. So one of the things that I get asked a lot is open API Swagger API specs for Scim. Is that on the table? Have people talked about that? I haven't been following this closely, but.
Sorry, say that again, Leif.
Open API specs for Scim, is that on the table? I mean, this is one of the things that gets brought up a lot, right, today, right, among implementers who sort of look at Scim and go, doesn't look like a modern API, doesn't have the open API specs, right? I can't code to that because I have to write all the interfaces myself, right? So it is what it is, right? So my question is whether that's part of the charter explicitly, or
we did not make it explicit in the charter.
didn't consider it, or okay.
We definitely
Yep.
consider. I mean, generally, in the groups that I've chaired, we try and use existing as opposed to creating APIs interfaces. So it's something we can consider.
Right.
Yeah, that's actually a great idea. Okay, so what you can see if you look at the HackMD
Hold on,
link.
Pam.
Oh, is there no? Oh,
Elliot's in
on.
the queue.
Yep.
Yeah, so Pam. if you look on that.
Hi, just good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Good evening to those further east. Just a slightly dissenting point of view on OpenAPI and Swagger. I'm not sure that it actually is rich enough and stands up to some of the use cases that we'll discuss later. So Leaf, I would be very interested in your comments when I come around to talking about IoT, okay?
Yeah, Elliot, as the chair, I didn't mean to infer that we would adopt open API. It's more the question as a group, we shouldn't be as closed-minded, right? But your point is well taken
I think at least we would want to evaluate, right?
and have rationale, pros and cons. Yeah.
Okay, so what you see here is a first attempt to make the outline for the use cases and concepts diagrams, the headings, if you will, for the document. And so what they really represent are the concepts that we actually think implementers would need to understand in order to understand how to use Scim. Right now, I have roughly created some rationales around these. As far as definitions go, I believe we probably don't want to redefine some of the things in the normative specs, but we might want to define some of the more business-like use cases. So for example, I have user management and group management and provisioning listed here, right? So in the case where people may not understand, for example, what group management is, right? It's just should be just enough to help people understand that term's being used. So any definitions that would maybe not be applicable in the normative spec, but would be useful for the overall understanding of the concept would go here. The next section is the concepts section. And so I believe that these are basic concepts around provisioning, right? Around, some of the industry ideas. So what does it mean to have a start of authority, right? So this, being able to say that a given entity is authoritative for an attribute, right? Or authoritative for an account is sort of the idea behind start of authority. Data directionality. So the idea of is it master slave, or are you just pushing things straight out? Or is it a bidirectional sharing? Because in the case of bidirectional sharing, it obviously matters on an attribute by attribute basis, which party in the transaction is authoritative for what. So that one's very loaded and may deserve a section of its own. Just-in-time provisioning. So a definition of what just-in-time provisioning is for, so that it can be used later. Schema and resource types. So sort of the object model. Mutability and uniqueness. So again, not just what they are, not just a definition, but an explanation of why they're necessary in provisioning scenarios, right? And of course, mutability and uniqueness then affect data, start of authority and data directionality. So these things become linked to each other. Identifiers and primary keys. So in this case, the understanding of, for example, why in Scim we have to have an external ID, right? We can put some explanation in there. API security, which is typoed. So under API security, my thought was just explaining how a Scim endpoint can be secured, right? Just enough information. Some of this, if you feel like it's too obvious, please just add a comment in the document, because there's just a question of where do you draw the line for what's you can realistically expect these folks to know about. Hard and soft deletion, I think, is another concept that it would help to have people know in advance when they try to plan their implementations. And then privilege elevation. So those are the concepts. So I guess the first question I would have is, does anybody want to comment on the level, right, the altitude of these concepts? Do they make sense? It's sort of an industry altitude. Is everyone comfortable with that?
Do you want us to run a poll? We can ask the room.
Yeah, we can run a poll.
You want me to do that?
If that's not hard to do. We could wait and.
Elliot is in the queue.
Oh, there we go.
Hi again. I think these are good things. I don't know that they're an exhaustive list. And I don't know that they need to be at this point, right? I think that the question you might want to be asking is, does anybody object to anything in this list? And I would be shocked if people did. But you might want to add to the list as we develop things out a bit more.
That makes sense. Also, I might not be using the right words, right? A lot of these have synonyms and other uses, so there might just be a more evocative term for the same
Yeah,
idea.
let me throw one example out. You talk about data directionality. Putting the schema aside, right? Let's talk about connection directionality, right? Which goes to the protocol, right? Is a RESTful protocol the only way that we want to do this, or are we thinking in terms of things like gRPC or WebSockets where we might want to reverse connectivity in some cases? And I'll give an example of that later.
That's a great point. Ned, I hope you caught that.
Okay, so I can run a poll, and is the question, does anyone object to the use case list, or you want me
To the concepts list.
list as the starting point for the
Yes.
use case draft?
And the next step will be that this goes into a draft and gets posted, and then, we will have full editorial control for people to add. I mean, you're welcome to add here, but obviously there'll be lots of steps in the future also.
Okay, is the poll running? How come I can't?
It's running.
I think it's 'cause you
18
started it.
answers.
I think you don't see it because you started it.
Oh, yeah. But it says start session. Oh.
I feel like we should have music.
No, you don't want me humming. So,
That's right.
yeah, so you can choose to not raise your hand if you have issues with the list.
I think the only issue there is if people just maybe are not connected, does that mean they are by default not raising their hand? Okay.
Is everybody apathetic, or did I not run the poll correctly?
I think we have 29 out of 29, so I think we're good. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Nancy, to help you with the process check, this is Roman speaking. I think you ran the poll right. I mean, my read is everyone, universally agrees that we have a pretty great starting point.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right.
So
Well,
you
let's
have your guidance.
great. Let's keep going. How am I for time? I know
You're
if I'm-
doing great.
okay,
You're
great.
11, 12 minutes in.
Okay, so the next one is use cases, and this was in I think the not the last interim meeting, but the one before. We had a conversation about this. What does a use case mean? And so the rationale that I've gone with here is, what are the chunks of Scim functionality, right? That people might want to achieve, right? So it's not a business use case; it is an implementation use case. And so what you'll see here, the use cases include negotiating schema. It includes search and query, object synchronization lifecycle, and then massive data set maintenance. So, I mean, that's a huge, like those four things are massive and can be broken down into subsections. But I don't have a sense of whether they're in any way enough, right? Like, I don't know that they're all sufficient. I do believe the massive, that management at scale is a theme that we want to spend time on, right? Because that includes pagination. It includes how do you bootstrap a connection in the first place. It includes how do you do bulk operations, all of that. But we may want to break that up. Like if there's a smarter way to break that into pieces, then we might want to do that. Right. So, and then, so one is sort of a life cycle, that really the idea of managing a given object in Scim, which is how do you create it? How do you read it? How do you update it? How do you delete it? Right. And then the second one is now, how do you do these things across at massive scale? All right. So I'm not hearing too many people. Does anyone want to comment, or is there an obvious one here of all of you who are implementing? Is there an obvious thing that you're doing today that isn't even mentioned here?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to come up and join the queue.
Oh, and we got Janelle too.
So Janelle, you're in the queue? Janelle, are you on mute?
Aha, here she comes.
Hello.
There we go. Now we hear you.
Hi. I think you've raised some really excellent points here. I think one of the other things is that there's some data that we've come across that may need protection, especially when it's a URL that's being transferred, like a URL to a photo. This has come up on occasion on separate notes. Danny has brought it up separately. So there might be some, how do we deal with sensitive data in the data sets, or how do you gain access to it as another item.
Okay, that one might fit in the next section as well. So I might just skip to the next section and then have everyone comment on mass, unless, oh wait, we have another one. We have a comment here.
Hi, this is Hans-Jörg. Sorry for interrupting right now.
No, this is good. It's meant to be a discussion.
So if I do a peek preview of the next section already, I find actually the use cases this way a little technical. So for
Okay.
instance, if I see user self-service, I actually wonder, like, Scim in the general sense for me reads like more like an enterprisey math thing, which is also reflected in the use cases in the technical part here. But self-service, on the other hand, doesn't seem to me be reflected in the use cases so far, or would probably fit in some way.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. They're definitely pretty technical. Would you be willing to add, put an example in that you think would be?
I can try.
Yeah, that would be great. This is the more points of view, the better, for sure. Fantastic. Okay, well then, yeah, let's go through the use cases. The comment I think is that it's okay if one of these two sections is geeky, but they shouldn't both be, right? Like in some sense you want, my hope for the scenarios was to essentially tie some of the geeky things together into end-to-end scenarios that would resonate with an implementer. So, I think this is where anyone who is implementing, if you're not seeing a thing that resonates with you, then it's clearly the wrong list. So we'll just quickly go through those example scenarios. So the first one I think is our canonical example. However, that just might reflect my bias. So it says, so a SaaS app writes a multi-tenant integration to get data from a cloud platform. And I've set it up to be any cloud platform so that I could highlight how schema negotiation or how dynamic schema checking could work. I, again, don't know if that's realistic. I know it's not a commonly used feature, but in some sense, if we can talk through some of the less commonly used things, then in theory, it would help people know how to use them. So in that case, we would write something nice about negotiating schema, understanding how to do an initial download, an initial synchronization of account and group data, right? And then maybe, after some amount of time, perform a full-on reconciliation to make those things, to be sure those things match, right? So the implication I have when I say reconciliation is that maybe the service halted for a minute and you lost access, so you weren't sure if every Scim command was received, for example. And I believe that's a concern that we've heard talked about in the various meetings, right? How do I know if I've missed something? And the difference in my mind between reconciliation and an incremental update is one is a brute force download, and the other one is a mechanism for knowing what the delta might be between what you have and what you wish you had. Okay, so the next one is progressive profiling, which the idea behind that is that it would be customer, a SIAM, customer identity kind of use case where you would in fact want to collect data directly from a user and then write it back to an authoritative source. So imagine you go to buy a car, and because you've only been a marketing subscriber up until that point, they need to ask for some inline important data before they can continue with the purchase. That's the progressive profiling use case. And then, the user self-service would be the idea that you go manage your profile in a web page or a web portal, and then that data then gets pushed through, through the chain. And then The last three, so the first one is a bulk address change. And my thought here is that it would be large enough scale so we could discuss pagination. It would be, you would want to search with a filter, right, to only find users who have a building that matches the old building that we're moving out of. And that you would then change the data in the address by running, a patch up, a bulk update operation incrementally to change only those accounts that have, that where the building has changed. And then the last two, so we have no group management right now at all in the use cases and concepts. So, getting enough information there that people can understand the trade-offs for managing massive groups is a big deal. So this idea of how do you replace a user or a member in a group that has 1 million users? How do you do that without literally doing a get of every single user and then having to change only one attribute? And then the last one is the idea of extending schema. So that is, again, something that isn't in the use cases and concepts. So just giving a story that normalizes how that can happen. So after all of that, so it's basically just storytelling at the end of the day. So maybe we can run a poll again. You're welcome to add more stuff, like either more detail to the stories or suggestions for different stories. If anything you can do up front now just means that the initial draft will reflect it, and you'll always have the chance to change it later. But
So is this content sufficient
right,
to serve as a base draft?
sounds like a good poll. Oh, we have someone on the queue too.
Oh, Antoine, you're in the queue?
Hello?
Oh,
Sorry.
I can never tell.
Oh, no, so I completely forgot for those that are on site to manage the queue, they also do it on the Meetup.
Yeah. I had some use cases coming from IoT and cellular network background. How do you manage the change of ownership on devices is something that I think could be interesting, because if obviously in business use cases, you have to change ownership for a set of objects from one person to another. And one thing that is also important from my perspective is to manage the fact that company fails. And objects are in the field for 20 years. So how do you change the authority that manages the keys and the trust relationship for a given set of objects? I think those two aspects are very important things to consider if you want to go in IoT.
Oh, I expected you to stay in the queue, as I thought you might answer. Elliot, you're back on the queue.
Yeah, I typed something into the chat. I was going to say, Pam, that I wonder if we could defer the poll on this part of the discussion until after the IoT presentation, because you'll probably want to pick something up. I'm not going to try and tell you how to format every last thing here, right? I just think there's going to be food for thought after that presentation, and some digesting may need to happen as well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, I'm happy to call this section done, and
Yeah, I mean, as Elliot says, we can run a poll to give you guidance if you still need it.
Okay.
Because I put Elliot next because he also has a use case.
Right.
To address the IoT.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. We got some time back. All right. So next up is Elliot. So Elliot, did you want to share your slides, or do you want us to?
Do you mind if you share them? That way, I think it's probably just as easy.
Yes.
All right. So I did up these use cases with Janelle, who I will now use as an example. Next slide, please. So how are these identities different, and how are they the same? Each of these identities require credentials. It so happens that Janelle has a lot more capability to prove herself. She has fingers, eyes, and the ability to type, and the light bulb doesn't. Right? There's no user interface on the light bulb. There's no means for the light bulb to provide a lot of context just visually, other than blinking or something. Next slide. So this is a big problem in terms of just getting things on board to a network. We want things to seamlessly be able to use Wi-Fi. We want things to be able to seamlessly use different connection technologies. And for those people who've been paying attention to the side meetings that we've been having and the meetings we've had in the IoT Ops group, the nice thing about onboarding standards is that there are so many of them. So the key question is, right, here we have a provisioning thing. We know we need to provide some information about the device into a local environment. We might need to delete old devices. There may be a need to update existing devices, and there might be a need to group devices. I say maybe might. You're hearing a little bit of hedging, because I think we're just getting going in the context of Scim. The question is, why not use Scim? And so we wanted to start with at least the concept and see where it goes. Next slide, please. So this is a fairly texty slide. I apologize for that. But the key thing here is that we want to be able to do as much automation of provisioning as possible. So the very basic notion is, you buy something, it should even be possible to automate the transfer of credentials relating to a device. And what's important to understand is that devices need proof that they're connecting to the right place, as much as the network needs proof, or an application needs proof that a device is allowed to talk to it. The industry really wants a standard approach to that, and as I mentioned, there are many different standards. I've listed a couple here. This has a lot of implications in terms of schema design, right? The company I work for, Cisco, used to have a slogan, I don't know if it's still out there, no technology religion. Well, we don't want to have to make choices about technology at this level. We want to have an expansive view at this moment in time. Maybe later on in life there will be consolidation, but that's certainly not where we are, not only in terms of L2 technology, but even on top of L2, in terms of the mechanisms that are used to provision things. So as you see below, right, there, to provision onto Wi-Fi, you might use DPP, or you might find a way to use 8366 vouchers, or you might find a way to do other means of provisioning. For BLE, you might use the OOB mechanisms that are defined. You might do some weird thing with pairing keys, which has been done out there. And you might use FIDO FDO vouchers for any of this. So what this means is that we need a certain amount of normalization. And we might even need multiple levels of normalization. And this is something that I think Scim presents a challenge for at the moment. Next slide. So just to put this in a more graphic view, right? You have a device. It might have Wi-Fi capabilities. It might have 802.3 capabilities. And you can just see this mesh of different onboarding standards that might be used in these different cases. And so, yeah, here again, it's no technology religion. And this is sort of a use case that we expect to have happen, because there's not likely to be a consolidation anytime soon. And we just want to be able to support whatever it is the device happens to support, right? And the key thing here is, if we go down that right side, what does it mean in terms of schema? For DPP, this is device provisioning protocol by the Wi-Fi Alliance. It's public key that needs to be transmitted into the deployment so that the device knows that has the corresponding private key can do a cryptographic exchange to establish trust. For 8366, this is a voucher from the manufacturer saying, hey, device, you should trust this deployment. FIDO has something very similar to an 8366 voucher, which is called FDO. BLE-OOB is very similar to DPP in terms of using a public key. And then key pairs are, of course, sort of the poor man's version of that. Next slide, please. So the other thing here that we noticed.
Elliot,
Yep.
you've got Leif on the queue.
Okay. Hi, Leif.
Hey, this might be like a clarifying question or not. Or maybe something you're getting to later, and if so, please stop me, right? But you mentioned that all of the various types of key material and device types will require some sort of update to Scim and to the security way we do security for Scim. Right now, I think it's specified in terms of bearer tokens, right? And what I'm wondering is, like, even if you have all of this complexity on the devices, right? You have some sort of key. Couldn't you, like, you use a token exchange, token translator approach to, like, get yourself a JOT token and use that to talk to the Scim server? So how is this a problem for Scim, right? The fact that you have all of these.
Yeah. Okay. So the issue here, right, is we're not attempting, in the IoT use case, we're not attempting to modify the IoT devices themselves, right? The use case in this case is to take what the IoT device offers, right, and allow the local deployment to have access to the necessary information in order to onboard that device.
Sure, but understood. But the IoT device has some key, something, right?
Yep.
Right. And what I'm trying to get at is exactly how does this affect Scim, right? Because all you need to feed to the Scim server in order to make it happy is a bearer token, a JOT token or something, right? And you can get that through any kind of mechanism if you have access to some sort of key material on the client. So why does the fact that you have a wide range of client types and key material, why does that affect Scim?
So it's a matter of what we're talking about here is creating a device hierarchy within Scim, if you will, or a device schema within Scim, right?
So it's a schema issue, not an authentication issue.
Correct.
It's a schema issue, exactly. Okay. Okay, sorry, I wasn't clear there.
Tim Capelli is on the queue too.
And that trailed right into my comment. I think the one thing I would say as someone who worked on the more of the non-headless device space, this is not unique to IoT, and I think it should be positioned as devices, right? And like if you look at a directory, right, we store billions of device relationships side by side with user objects that are not IoT devices. So it's really devices. Just
Absolutely.
Just for the general information. Yeah.
Okay, I think you've caught me out using the letters I, O, and T together. I only mean devices. So the other issue here is we see the need for directionality to be flipped in terms of who's talking to whom. The use case that Scim was initially designed for was you have an enterprise that's using some cloud-based service, and you want to mass provision the cloud-based service based on the user base that's in the enterprise. In this case, you might have partners that are providing, or suppliers that are providing devices to the enterprise. And in this case, you actually want those guys to transmit the credentials that are necessary for the enterprise to make use of those devices. So there's a little bit of a directionality issue, right? It's not add this user to your service, it's add this device to your inventory, is really what's being asked here. And it's meant to be used in conjunction with the other mechanisms then to onboard the device on, say, the network or in applications. Next slide. So this is not there was an old commercial in the 1980s that said, this is not your father's Buick. Well, this is not your parents' Scim, right? This is a little different. First of all, bootstrapping credential movement is required in these cases. In the cases that we're discussing, it's not something that will happen sometimes. It's something that's likely to happen every time. The supplier may be the Scim client as opposed to a service that the enterprise calls out. Although the connection direction is something that we do need to discuss in a lot more detail. The device identities here need to be clearly scoped, especially if you have multiple suppliers. You don't want one supplier dinking with another supplier's stuff. And this is directly analogous to if you're a service like Salesforce, you don't want one enterprise's provisioning operations impacting another enterprise's provisioning operations. The device attributes are going to vary based on the capabilities of the device, and this has schema implications. And there's likely to be a desire to carry other stuff, so extensibility will remain important. So examples that I give are software bill of materials information, which is very hot right now. It's a very hot topic, both in the US and Europe. Device type information is another thing that enterprise administrators really want to have. They don't just want to know that a device is being onboarded. They want to know what the device is that's being onboarded, so they can understand how to deal with it. These are some examples of variances that you might see. Next slide. So this raises a couple of questions, right? One question is, what is the relationship between users and devices then? Is there a notion of ownership here that has to be assigned? And owners in the certainly in the enterprise, devices will have owners or people who are responsible for these things, but it's not clear that the supplier has to actually be the one that sets that. And in fact, probably the supplier doesn't. But that doesn't mean there's no relationship. The other question is, as I went through this, right, it became hard to understand which schema language to use to describe all this. And so we actually did up our initial schemas in JSON schema. And I like it because it's sufficiently rich to accomplish the job, and yet it's still readable, unlike certain schema languages. So these are just some of the things, and we do need multiple refs, real refs, to be able to call in various polymorphic-like things. And as I said, in my initial attempts at least, and I won't claim to be a Swagger expert, but in my initial attempts at this with Swagger, I absolutely got frustrated, and I did spend a fair amount of time trying to get through some of those frustrations in terms of having a fully normalized view. So these are just some things that I raised for comment.
Elliot, you have Eric on the queue.
Okay.
Eric Nordmark. So from an information flow perspective, it's clear that the supplier is actually providing a bunch of information, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of credentials, etc., right? SBOMs, whatever. Want to add in that. But from the perspective of who is initiating the operation to add this thing to the system, it's not clear that's the supplier. Because
you could go in either direction.
You might want to wait until the light bulb showed up, the palette of light bulb showed up on the loading dock, right? Until you do that, right? So it's not clear that this communication thing necessarily changes. And if you think of it that way, then you have, as the sort of enterprise accepting this stuff, you can now say, okay, I'm going to put these things in these groups or whatever other structural things you have, right? Similar to the way you handle users and putting them in groups or organizations or whatever. So I don't think it's actually that different.
Well, I think you can see it both ways, Eric. And I think both models are perfectly reasonable to pursue.
You've got Tim on the queue.
Hey, Tim Quelli, Microsoft. I think the one thing that's different in this world is that you essentially have a bootstrap IDP and then the final IDP. So there's really two IDPs at play, which doesn't traditionally exist on a user. That's because ultimately, like DPP, for example, the supplier needs to essentially send you a list of public keys, map them to something, and then drop them in. And then at that point, you can provision a new credential that's specific to your organization. So I think that's the difference in the flows as well.
Yeah, this doesn't talk about what happens once the enterprise receives the information. There's mere presumption that the right thing happens, but I don't get into any details in this discussion about what that is, right? As you said, Tim, in DPP, there'll be maybe a DPP 2.0 exchange, and then there'll be a certificate. And one example will be a certificate provisioning for that individual device, trust anchor, exchange, yada, yada, yada. For 8366, it might just be a conversion from an IDEV ID to LDEV ID communication online, however that might occur, et cetera. And so all of that mechanism, I don't think we should have to go into great detail in the Scim group. All we should be able to do is support the transfer of the information so that it can get there, interdomain. Questions, comments, because that's it, I think. Next slide. Is there a next slide? Okay.
You just posed a question. You've got Tim on the queue.
Sorry. I should have said, by the way, as someone who's been trying to battle this for 7 years prior to joining Microsoft, I'm very supportive of this.
I think I hear a co-author.
Okay, so Elliot, your last question is a draft. That's kind of open-ended. And
Well, yeah, because I don't really know exactly how we want to take this forward, and I sort of I'm in your hands, chairs.
yeah, so at minimum, it needs to be captured in the use cases, just so that, I do believe it's in charter, as we are saying we need to update the use cases. All of this, we obviously need to get consensus from the group, right? So we did defer the poll for the way forward for the use case draft. And so one potential avenue is for you to incorporate these concepts into the use case content, and I can make that addition to the poll. Or you could create a proposal. I think earlier on, I think Leif asked a question on, what's the main update change here? And I think the use case may clarify that. The second step or similar step could be you generate a draft that shows that way forward and a proposal of what that might look like.
Actually, I'd really like to hear from Pam as to how she'd like to proceed on this a little bit.
No, you do not. We recognize you, Pam.
So I think the question is, if it is a draft, I think, what are we looking at, a schema extent? Like, do we have to make that technical leap first, or do you just want to talk about the use cases?
There's two parts to it, right? It's the solution, what that may look like, but then there's the recognition that this is a valid use case, and that's where I'm suggesting, we could create a separate use case draft, but we said we would be updating it. So for me, it feels logical as you're working on the adoption that you could incorporate the content, but.
That would be my preference.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think too, there's at least 3 people who have knowledge and expertise here, right? So I think we have enough people to flesh out something that others could then riff on, right? So I'm in support.
So I could make one poll, and if that doesn't go, then I can break it up into multiple polls. So how about if I do a poll of, I'm going to short it into, is the HackMD content presented by Pam, and Elliot's IoT use case sufficient? Oh, you're getting back on the queue?
Yeah, I just realized something. Hold on. Sorry. Just thought of a reason. So one thing is we have to decide what the use cases and concepts document applies to. So if this kind of IoT work is new work, then it might actually be applicable to a new version. Like if we're going to write a use cases and concepts for the existing RFCs, 76, 43, and 44, then that might need to be a different work effort than the new work that this would constitute. I don't know, does that, I mean, we could wrap them together, but I do feel like a description that is purely Scim 2.0 is valuable. But if
Yeah,
others disagree.
So I don't know if we concluded as to the update, because we discussed this, I think, in 112 and in the virtual, but we didn't conclude as to whether the update would be to Scim 2.0 or if we would just do a jump and the updates would really be creating a Scim 3.0.
So we might want to do that scope question first. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, we've got more people on the queue. Phil, you're next in queue. Phil, are you on mute? It's not, his audio is not working. So Phil's comment on the chat is on the Jabber that Elliot's draft is just a new schema, but this is more on the revisioning of the draft. So Phil, can you speak? Okay, while we're waiting for Phil, Colin, you will
Sure.
be
So I was just going to say, my comment's really simple, which it seems like these could be split apart as two different pieces of work of the devices stuff and the refreshing the other thing. So my only advice would be just everything that can be split apart. Why not? I mean, unless they have to be deeply coupled in some way. And I'm in favor, of course, dealing with devices. I hate the word IoT, but I like the word devices. But it seems like it could be split apart. So with that, let me jump off.
Yeah, we can argue IoT versus devices later. It's the body of work. But Colin, sorry, you might have to come back. So are you speaking that it would be okay to incorporate it into the use case draft and then we decide as to whether the solution gets split? Or...
Yeah, sure. I just think that documenting the actual protocol solution, you probably can split them up and have one be an extension to the devices be an extension to the base, and split that up. And as far as use cases, yeah, put them all in one place. Thanks.
Yep, thanks. Okay, Phil, should we give you another try? No, we lost him. Okay, Elliot, while we're still waiting for Phil.
Yeah, I'm fine with breaking up work where it can be broken up. My only comment is simply that this is not just schema work. There's connection model, there's data direction. We should, I was figuring we would just cross those bridges when we came to them, flowing from the use cases. That's all.
Yeah, and that's why I tried to explain that first we need to recognize it as a use case in the group, and then we determine the path forward and the actual technical work. Danny, you were on the queue and you disappeared. I'm presuming you're back. Danny, you had a comment?
It was pretty much just to say, once we get into my section, this is one of the key things that I want to cover, which is essentially what's 2.0, whatever the next is, like 2.1, 3.0.
Okay.
And specifically that use cases thing that Pam stepped back up.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Phil. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
So Danny, I think you got your point. Thank you. Okay, Phil, we can now hear you.
I'm worried because I have to talk later. Sorry.
Yeah, I was like, I cannot do all the slides, Phil.
It is breaking up a lot, so hopefully we'll have success. I just wanted to say to Elliot.
Go ahead.
I think Elliot's could be a new draft. The big part of it is new schema, and it also occurs to me that along with devices, we need authenticator schema as well. So that might be two drafts. And then the reverse flow might be accommodated with the security event tokens, and we'll see more about that later.
Okay, so Phil, just to clarify, you are speaking to the technical solution. The question that I want to put on the poll is whether we should incorporate the IoT/devices as a use case in the updated use case draft. Are you speaking in favor or against?
Can
Hopefully
you
we
say
do.
that again? I've got
Are you
bandwidth
okay?
issues, it
Are you
appears.
okay incorporating the IoT use case in the base use case draft? It's use cases, not technical solution.
Hello?
We, can you hear me now? I'll put in the chat. I just typed, he hasn't typed, no private chats. Okay, well, he can vote against it. Let me just run the poll because we are well over time. Sorry, yeah. So we are well over time. So let me run the poll and then we need to move forward. So start the session. Come on. My machine, crank the bits. Come on. Can you see the code? Come on. There we go. Okay, so this question is, since Pam presented the outline that's in the HackMD for base content, it's not final, it just enumerates some, but it gives us a starting point. And then Elliot also produced a use case that goes to IoT/devices. Can we incorporate both of them, and can that serve as the base for Pam and Elliot to start the use case draft? So raise your hand if you believe that to be the case or not. Okay, it's not just my connection. Okay, we're going to give it 10 more seconds and I'll close it.
While we wait for that, can I just jump in with my?
Okay, yeah.
So,
10
I mean,
seconds.
you're still gonna do an.
I still have to do a call for adoption
Yeah.
on the draft.
So.
Yeah.
All right.
But Pam wanted guidance and, Elliot presented the use case. So, okay. So Pam, you have rough consensus. Julie, you have good consensus, 24. So what you can do is we can give you a public that's not adopted yet in the Scim working group, and you can put stuff there and you and Elliot can move forward. Okay, with that, we are running well over. Danny and Janelle, protocol and schema. Did you want us to share the slides or did you want to use, present them yourselves?
Could you please share them?
And it's one. It didn't, yeah, it was loaded. Give us a second, we loaded them, but. Oh, it's there. Yep, there it is. No, but it's there. It's this one. This one, yeah. And now you go back and then, yeah, you share. Oh. Okay. That's what I did in TEEP. There's something about this room. Well, that's what happened to me. I was in this room. We're getting there. Okay, Danny, even though we see them, we can't seem to share them. Can you try sharing them?
Second.
Yeah, I had the same problem on Monday, and I was in the same room.
Okay, I'm going to give sharing a shot.
Yeah. Did you get access? Yep. Should be coming any second. There
Oh,
we
we
go.
Okay.
You can see them.
Okay, cool. So yeah, my name's Danny Zollner. I also have with me Janelle Allen. And we are the currently like nominated for tribute editors for Schemas and Protocols. Next slide, please. Oh wait, I'm presenting, so I I have to do the next slide. Bear with me. So yeah, just a quick sort of run through things. So the current charter that we have, I provided a link. And one of the things that's been proposed and discussed, especially I believe in IETF 112, but also in the interim sessions that we've had in between, is the topic of progressing the Scim 2.0 standard from proposed standard, which is where it sits today, into internet standard, sort of its final form. And there's sort of a floating question of, is there significant value there? Like, do we polish up Scim 2.0, put a bow on it, finalize it? Or do we just sort of leave it as proposed standard and work on 2.1 or 3.0 or whatever we may call it? I think I refer to it as vNext in most of the remainder of the deck. And then there's another floating question of what level of error correction, clarity enhancement, et cetera, is permissible without issuing a new version in RFC series. It's sort of like, what is it, the shipmaker's problem, where if you replace all the wood on a boat one board at a time, at what point does it stop being the same boat? Like, how much can we change it with it actually still remaining 2.0? And to that, I strongly look towards the chairs for guidance. But I wanted to just put that out there. It is one of the big problems that we're trying to wrap our heads around today, of how much of the charter that we have today, how much of it is a charter today, thoughts are getting jumbled. How much of it is doable today versus in a future version. And then, so the charter proposed a lot of schema and protocol enhancements. Virtually all of those are too big to be part of 2.0, if we're looking at that as error correction and whatnot. So there's then a question that I would like to be discussed, which is, do we go towards 2.1, 3.0, or do we finalize 2.0 and just throw out a litany of extensions to cover the 20 plus topics that the charter would like us to cover? So I'm going to move to the next slide. And just quickly, here's all of the work related to schemas and protocols that's listed in the charter. It's available at that link that I also previously shared. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's everything from sort of clarifying and expanding on usage of things like external ID, changes and expansion to account state, completely new concepts like multi-value query filtering and paging, and a couple of other things as well. And it's just there's no conceivable way that we do this inside of 2.0. So I really want to get like a group consensus and figure out how we proceed forward. And one quick thing to share also, we have set up, with the chair's help, a GitHub organization, and we have a couple of repos containing the current XML versions of the schema and the protocol APIs. And we're going to be working on sort of tracking the various issues as GitHub issues to easily facilitate sort of discussion and proposed solutions throughout that, which we will still also then recap and bring things to discussion over the Scim mailing list as well. And there's just a couple of notes on the plan of how we proceed here. I'm not going to linger on this unless anybody has questions. I'll send this out via email as well. So I guess one of the big topics, and I'm trying to get through this quickly because this is a discussion, really. The goal here is feedback. One of the things that if we were to push 2.0 to be internet standard, we would need to do a survey on the implementation of concepts. And honestly, even if we're not pushing it for 2.0, there's probably still value in figuring out, are there parts in the survey, are there parts in the 2.0 standard in the schema or protocol that just aren't adopted, either at all or widely or in an interoperable manner. And so we'd like to get feedback on that and sort of start the ball rolling on either cutting or resolving issues with certain parts of the existing standards. I'm sorry, let me go back a second. And so, yeah, just a couple of examples there. Basic auth in the in 2.0, Scim was, Scim 2.0 was published in 2015. At this point in time, just, I think it's sort of inexcusable to use basic auth on like the, an internet-facing implementation of Scim versus something like a bearer token or some form of OAuth. There's also, passwords. If the common law of the land nowadays, and the industry standard is federation between an IDP and something else, is their value in the core schema, at least, containing passwords. I'm aware that there are certain, mostly we'll call them like legacy concepts where you might be provisioning into some, like a mainframe or something where you must provide a password, and that makes sense. But whether or not those are sort of internet facing and whether they line up with the sort of the goal of the Scim standard is up in the air. If we look at the name, it's the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. God, I'm not on my A game today. Sorry. And there's other things like photos as well, which we've discussed in the interim, which from a sort of cross-cloud standpoint are hard, if not impossible, to implement due to security concerns. So just, it's a it's not an entire list. The goal, again, we want other people to get involved rather than it just being Janelle and I trying to figure things out on the schemas and protocols. Is anybody seeing this slide correctly? It looks incredibly. I just switched to the next slide. It looks bad.
I don't know what happened there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I happen to have the slide up on my other monitor, so it's a very short slide. So the title of it is XY problem, and I have a bullet that says, "Are some concepts useful but potentially outside the scope of what the Scim standard aims to address?" With a sub-bullet that says, "Some decisions on cuts and edits to 2.0 should wait until after use cases are revised." And then there's a question that sort of came up when Pam and Elliot were speaking as well, which is the work to revise use cases targeted at 2.0 at the VNext of 2.1, 3.0, whichever, or both? Which I think that, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Phil has been on the queue. He just dropped from the queue. I didn't know if he had a comment on your slide. Phil?
Bueller?
Oh, no comment. Okay, never mind. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, and so finally, just bring it to a recap. I really just landed it to the question, or the questions that are floating. And at this point, anybody who's here, I want opinions, because I've got my own, but the Scim standard is not mine, and I don't like. I want feedback, please, on what people's thoughts are on really each of these big points.
We actually had allocated 40 minutes so that we could have a discussion. So any feedback for the protocols or the schema or the combination of both? Paul, I think you're in the queue. Go ahead, Paul.
I am in the queue. Good morning. So my perspective on this is that we should do the right thing. So as implementers, I think looking at a long series of extensions can get really complicated. And so the more we incorporate it into the core spec, I think the better the likelihood is that we'll have full compliance with the intended outcome of this working group in future implementations.
Okay, thank you.
Janelle? Janelle, you're a presenter, so you don't have to get in the queue, by the way.
I know, I just didn't want to interrupt anybody. One of the things when we've been exploring things is we look at the core schema, and there is a lot in the core schema comprising an identity. And there's a lot of questions that come into play regarding that. Like, for instance, it may be valid to keep passwords around for some use cases, but perhaps driving that into its own extension or sub-schema of the core. And same goes for some of the other schema elements. But if we start breaking it apart like that and take them out of the core, then, what does that mean for those who've implemented 2.0? That sounds like more like a 3.0 thing, which is kind of where some of the thoughts that we've had have gone when we've been discussing, like, how do we just put a bow on 2.0? Like, should we just do light edits, say, this is it, and give 2.0 the credibility it has? Lots of people have implemented it as it is, with some clarifications, fixing the errata, some really clear use cases of how to work with the spec as it is, or just say, that's it, this was a great standard, it served its purpose for its time, like, let's drive forward on 3.0. I think that's where we wind up half the time. That's where Danny and I are coming from, is just how light do we want to be, or how quickly do we start coloring outside of the 2.0 lines before it's not 2.0 anymore?
I mean, doing the survey and eventually, once you get a draft out there with reviewers, I'm sure you'll get feedback, just as the TLS working group did, although they also took a survey before they deprecated 1.0. Phil, you're in the queue.
Phil's having audio issues. I can relay his comment. He says, question is regarding photos. Photos is just a URI. There is no obligation to import or pass an image into Scim. Is that the issue?
So yeah, photos came up in one of our I think this is our most recent interim session as well, and I never got a chance to follow up on it over the working group email. So the problem with photos from sort of like a SaaS or like a cloud internet scenario is if photos in the spec right now is described as a URL, and at that point you're communicating the URL, and the other side would just so I guess the client communicates the URL, and the server would then have the URL on hand to go pull the picture from. There's problems there, though, of how does the client, especially when it's over the internet rather than on an intranet, where there's firewall rules and just security is a little more easily managed. How does the server come back and retrieve that image to use in its own service? Sort of like hot linking to it and just pulling the image every time it needs to be loaded isn't necessarily feasible. And just from my own experiences, which color my my thoughts here, any like SaaS implementers that I've talked to who have service providers who want to consume pictures, they want to be able to receive a picture and store it in their service so that there's no meaningful latency when they go to show it in somebody's profile. And so that whole like approach to pictures isn't something that's really doable today with what's described in the Scim spec.
Hans.
Yep. Sorry, hi. This is Hans-Jörg again. So I've sort of a question, sort of a comment. So with respect to that question now, how to deal with making this Scim 2.1, making it Scim 3.0, something like that. My observation as somebody digging into Scim very recently and discovering Scim very recently is that there is quite some wide adoption actually in a quite specific use cases like identity providers provisioning SaaS services, and that this is actually very widespread. So a lot of services are supporting that. So I wonder if there would be some major breaks or major changes that it probably would be very difficult to change all these implementations. And so far, it was very difficult for me to identify other users or use cases so far. So I'm a little bit surprised, or it's new to me to see there is so much interest in IoT. At least I didn't easily stumble upon that while introducing myself to Scim before. So my question a little bit is also, is there some, which I think would be helpful for casting that decision about how to go forward with the update of the standards, is basically, does anybody actually have an overview of which different domains exist and use cases or are already implemented? And if not, that might be, I think, very helpful in order to cast that decision.
Yeah, Pam, I want to say in the BOF we had a cursory, it wasn't complete. So we could try and bring that up in an introduction, perhaps in a virtual interim to help with that. Or go ahead, Pam. Oh. And then
Yeah, I think there's some interesting question about, so the use cases that we did see that were new, often they were characterized as schema extensions, and they included HR use cases. We can definitely go back and look at what those are, but yeah, I think we have a starting point for that kind of overview, if you will.
There were two main categories. There was the updating of the protocols for scalability. And then from a schema, it was, I think we used the word modernizing, relating to the fields that an HR database might have. But as Pam said, we can bring those back. They may actually be noted also. Oh no, it was in the BOF, never mind. But we can bring those back up. Your point is well taken. Thanks. So Danny, I should channel Philip's response to your response to the URI and photos. Is there was discussion before, but maybe it was on a virtual. But anyway, there was consensus from before that implementers wanted to choose how to solve the problem, as opposed to addressing. So that was Phil's feedback.
Yeah, from my own experience, there's a lack of adoption for specifically photos because there is no standardized way to approach it. So it's really, I think, a question of is the current photos, just sticking with this, fleshed out enough to actually be adopted at all? And I suspect that the answer is yes, based off of what Phil said in the previous interim. However, this in turn, I think, brings us to the third bullet point on the slide that I'm showing right now, which is, even though it's not really milestone related, but for things related to the schema and protocol, should we like try and get the use cases to cover things, like to cover, essentially to describe the problem that we're going to solve? Because the description of how to do photos in Scim today works in certain scenarios, but it doesn't really work in like the internet SaaS scenario, which is yeah, I don't know why there's an echo. But so yeah, photos work somewhere, but does it work for what Scim is actually trying to solve? I guess is the question, and this then expands out to a whole bunch of other things like passwords.
Yeah, so absolutely for some of the new work, you'll be guided through the use cases. I thought in the charter we had some examples of the updates that needed to happen vis-a-vis the schema. I'd have to go back and look at the charter. So Danny, the schema and the protocol is going to be gated somewhat by the use cases, but I felt that there was enough of an understanding that some of the work, not all, could be done in parallel. If that's not correct, then I stand corrected.
I think some of it can be done in parallel. If I still need to figure out and do a vote or whichever on how we proceed, whether it's the 2.0 or a vNext, just so that we can have consensus. So I would like to, I guess, figure out how we word that and put it up to a vote here, or a show of hands on do we finalize 2.0 and build out a series of extensions, or do we work straight, do we just move towards 3.0? Or use 3.0 as a placeholder when I'm speaking, sorry, for whatever the next version number may be.
Leif is in the queue.
So I think the current version, the current published specs are 2.0. That's how they've been described for a long time, right? So I think whatever this is 2.1 or 3.0. And I try to split it up into individual GitHub issues and have a discussion. I mean, maybe starting with the, any identified fundamental stuff. That actually changes the protocol, in a way that maybe breaks backwards compatibility, but it certainly there is stuff here that maybe challenges underlying assumptions from the point of view of client implementers, and that should probably go first in the discussion queue to figure out what the implementation community is thinking about it. That's, I guess, what I would do. And then, yeah, there are plenty of extensibility hooks in Scim. There's no need to push everything into the core protocol if you don't have to.
Thank you.
Elliot, you're in the queue.
Thank you. I largely agree with Leif over what he just said, that having like an issue tracker will help. I think the more important thing to get to is to understand what good looks like rather than what the version number is. And as much as you can increment, I think it's good to increment. The question is, where do we need major change and what is incremental? And those can even proceed in parallel in some sense, if that's what people want. Where I slightly disagree, and only slightly disagree with Leif, and it's such a small matter that I probably shouldn't even mention it, but I think it's important to understand core protocol implications. What needs to be there, what in the core, what needs to be in the in extensions. I'm not sure that Scim is perfectly extensible. I think a little bit of elaboration in whatever follow-on specifications happen should be a lot clearer about, for instance, how do you fully normalize, right? Because there isn't a lot of example in that in Scim. And it's something that wasn't really I think it was contemplated, but at the time that Scim first came out, right, it needed to get done because people were waiting for it. So now we have a little time. It's worth at least making sure that things like normalization, schema language choice, all these things need a little bit of discussion. Thank you.
Janelle, you have something to say?
Yeah, well, thank you for your feedback, everybody who's provided it. And I think, yeah, we're just, trying to do what's right for the standard as it exists and as moving forward. There's certainly areas that are interesting too. And it comes up with regards to the identity providers. I think prior, when Scim 2.0 was coming about as a standard, there was this notion of the single authoritative source of identity data, pushing that data. The service providers can actually choose to accept or not accept a subset of core schema that's provided to them. And in part of our discussions was, well, should we have the service providers report back which attributes they're willing to accept from a client, so that, because they may not take them all. They might not take the password, for example, or they also may not take any of the other attributes. If they're, if they feel that they're the authority of the phone number and not the client, they might say, well, we're going to ignore that phone number. And so then this provides a notion of, well, then if you send that back and the client is expecting to then read back that data and match it with the data they have, and there's a mismatch, then how would you reconcile that? Or how would the client reconcile that? Or do you move to more of a notion of a composed identity profile, which might have data from multiple sources comprising the true identity of that individual? Was some of the other things that have come up, and it comes up to when we talk about, who's the authority on the device side for that device data and things like that as well. So there is definitely some overlap in that area. And I think it'd be great to get feedback on those thoughts.
Given the guidance, Danny and Janelle, you could put a first rough draft together and give that as a start, because we still have to do a call for adoption for it anyway, and I think you'll get more interest that way, given that you have more substance there for people to discuss and say, well, this may be missing, or we're not addressing this part, or we don't believe this part should be addressed. And the question is, do you have enough now to get you going? And then at the next virtual or at the next face-to-face or hybrid, you can do it that way.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, yeah, we're at the end of the slides. So I think at this point we'll sort of try and cut apart what can be accomplished without waiting for use cases, what we think should reasonably be waited for, to make sure that it aligns with the use cases. Like, is it a solution to a problem that we actually want to solve? And then we'll work forward from there.
Alrighty. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we keep bringing the mic back and forth just for you guys to know. We're trying to do our best, as there may be some feedback, but if I don't get it close, then some in the remote can't hear me. So next up is Phil, and he was going to present Scim events. There is a draft up, but he's having audio issues. He did send me a transcript. But my last question is, Phil, do you want to give it one last try, or do you want me to just read the transcript? What's that? Okay, he told me to go ahead and read it. So you guys bear with me. Stay awake. Okay, if you could share the slides. Great. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming out today. This presentation is about security events profile that I recently published as an individual draft. What are security events, and what are we proposing for Scim? You may be wondering what a profile is. I use that word to indicate we are not specifying something new. We're simply taking an existing set of specs and profiling them for use within Scim. So what are the security events then? Next slide. Oh, that was the agenda slide. Next slide. Sorry. Okay. What is a security event token? It is a specialized use of JOTs profiled or exchanging secure event messages between systems. In 2015, several groups inside and outside of the IETF were all planning to do the same thing. Morteza Sari of Cisco and then co-chair of Scim, William Dennis of Google, and myself, not me, Phil Hunt, then of Oracle, put together a draft specification in the Scim working group that extended JOTs for Scim events. This draft was submitted to address Scim's charter item of being able to send trigger events between systems. Because so many groups were thinking about the same thing, there was quick agreement for OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and risk incident sharing groups. I forgot to reset this. Risk incident sharing groups to work together on a common spec, which later became SET, or in the IETF, RC 8417, under the working group SEC events. So why use JOTs? For a couple of reasons. We wanted a JSON message format that could be signed and or encrypted. We wanted a form that could be secured independently of the medium for transfer. So what is a security event and what makes it different from the Scim protocol? One way to think about this is that Scim describes a set of synchronous HTTP requests along with a message format that work as API, in quotes, commands. However, events are simply signed statements delivered asynchronously, enabling a receiver to take some independent action. In Scim protocol, control lies with the requester, though the server is free to refuse. While in SET, control lies with the receiver. Why is this important? Well, in cross-domain scenarios, the users and group entities represented may not be the same population. And when they are, they may not contain the same attributes. What often does require coordination is a need to link life cycles of resources across domains. For example, a user disabled in domain A needs to ultimately be disabled in domain B. In an event system, the event receiver, which has full knowledge of its local domain, is able to take an external event, request more information if needed, and then reconcile that event to determine what local action should be taken, if any. Next slide. Okay, so the security event token spec, RC 8417, is the primary specification for Scim events. For those who want to implement set tokens, you can create sets using almost any JOT library. I hope to have a new library shortly with some convenient builders for Java shortly. Under the SEC events working group, two basic delivery specs were defined. The set push delivery, RC 8935 specification, allows a publisher to post an event to a registered web callback endpoint. And the set polling delivery spec, RC 8936, allows a receiver to initiate HTTP requests to retrieve new events. To enable real-time delivery, set polling also defines use of HTTP long polling. One aspect of these drafts is they do not require the set event publishers to guarantee long-term ability to recover events. Instead, the specifications require the receiver acknowledge each event received after the receiver has securely validated and secured a received event. When an event is acknowledged, the publisher is free to forget. Every recovery is left to the receivers. Why the heck did we do this? Well, I believe it was because some set use cases, like OIDC risk, OpenID risk, called for some publishers to have hundreds of thousands of event receivers. There were critical concerns that the ability for a publisher to retain past events for each specific receiver, that recovery may not be possible, as each event would take hundreds of thousands, 100K copies persisted for a long period. And if you have a few thousand ops per minute, that can be a lot of data. In these cases, it's far easier for the receiver to accept and maintain the event to its own needs. I note that in Scim scenarios, we likely won't have an out of balance cross-domain relationships with event receivers. I would anticipate relationships to be one to a few, or more likely one-to-one exchanges of information between domains. Fortunately, the set delivery specs do allow for longer event recoveries. They just don't mandate it. All this brings me to the issue of how can we implement this? Is there something that manages event feeds and implements the set transfer methods? For that, I want to turn to the presentation. Oh, crap. He's turning the presentation over to Nancy, that's me. As I can share some of the work that we're doing with the Cisco Duo team, and it is open source. So next slide, please. Okay, so basically, we've so hard talked about the sets. There is a new working group in the OpenID Foundation called the Shared Signals and Events. It is a framework that defines an API or interface, if you will, and I've put the link in there, that does leverage the use of the delivery streams using sets, using the set push and the set pull to manage effectively these streams that Phil has been mentioning. There are currently 2 schemas that are defined in there. Risk isn't quite going through last, Tim, if I recall. But the one that has been approved is the continuous authentication and evaluation protocol, fondly known as CAPE. And so what I listed in the table is the different event types that are defined in each of the schemas. And CAPE is the one that the working group is mainly latching on. Next slide, please. And so I think I lost the link there. We do have, Cisco did implement a reference implementation. So if you're interested to see how it gets used, the link is sharedsignalsguide.io. And if you guys are interested, did I put it in there? Oh, thank you. I thought I put it in there. It's there. Basically, the flow that's defined in the shared signals and events are in steps 2 and 3 that are being described there. The 1 and 2 is basically an endpoint doing the service request to a relying party, and then the actual meat of getting the event of I'm a security, so more like a security event like in CAPE, your authentication token has been revoked, is where that registration and pull happens in step 2 and 3. That's the shared signals and event work. And then the actual enforcement or remediation action is in step 4. So this is just like the stratospheric view of what SSE does. We wanted to give you that introduction so that you would know about it as we now bring it back to Scim. Next slide, please. And so the major use case here that has been talked about since the beginning of Scim, keeping resources between Scim servers coordinated and or in sync. The spec that identifies 2 variations. The domain-based replication has the objective that a single domain has a common schema and a common set of resources. The idea is that coordination messages be sent to enable each Scim server to stay in sync with the rest of the domain. With some minor exceptions, an event message simply repeats the Scim protocol request that is received. It contains all the data necessary to process the request as if it were received via RC 7644. the base scheme. Okay, coordinated provisioning allows the receiver to know that a publisher's resource has changed, what the type of change was, and the attributes changed. In this case, a set does not contain any raw data except for the ID and or the external ID, which are already shared between domains. When a receiver gets an event, it can mark its own resource as stale and take action. For example, after receiving an event, the receiver can perform a Scim GET request from the publishing service provider to see the current resource representation, and the receiver can then do a reconciliation of the changed resource. The reason for this two-step approach is that it avoids sharing of confidential information in scenarios that may involve out-of-band relays or otherwise. More importantly, if the domains care about different attributes, a lot of data may simply not be necessary because replication is not the primary goal. In coordinated provisioning mode, the receiver only needs to act when an attribute it cares about has changed. Then when the receiver does perform a Scim GET to obtain the changed resource, the server's normal access control can be used to filter attributes appropriately. Another advantage is that a receiver can wait to do reconciliation by simply marking a resource as stale and then update periodically, either in minutes or hours, in order to avoid repeated GET requests for a rapidly changing resource such as a group. We could have sent filtered data in the event for each feed subscriber, kind of like a limited DBR, but I believe this creates a number of problems. One, more event processing as events have to be specialized for every receiver. And also the publisher has to know what data the receiver is actually interested in. It has to have more awareness of the receiving domain. This may cause demarcation and control issues. Next slide, please. Okay. And here, what he's showing is that a client performs a normal Scim protocol request via post, put, patch, whatever, to a Scim service provider. The Scim provider responds with a success or fail. If successful, the provider then issues an event to replication receivers, who in turn repeats the operation locally to stay in sync. In the slide, I've shown only one replica, but it may be many to hundreds. Okay, in the next slide, for coordinated provisioning, a series of Scim operations are completed at a Scim provider, and then for each request, events are sent out to registered receivers. Depending on the event, a receiver may issue a Scim GET back to the publisher for the purpose of reconciliation. Once the modified resource is obtained, the receiver then decides what reconciliation action to take. Further, because the event simply marks the resource has changed, a receiver can opt to wait, like a minute, turning multiple changes into a single GET reconciliation. This two-step approach treats events as triggers to take a future action or to reconcile the differences between the providers. Next slide. So, security signal events have been talked about by the Scim working group prior to the risk or the shared signals group formation. In essence, these are higher level events that draw conclusions based on Scim schema. For example, a password has changed or reset. I should point out that these events in the draft, as they are somewhat duplicative of the OpenID Foundation shared signal risk events. The reason I put them in the draft is that the identifiers used in Scim events are the stable Scim identifiers. The ones used in the shared signals are somewhat more complex, allowing different subject identifiers to be used. I think we need to explore these events more thoroughly to decide if Scim should define its own signals or reference the external specifications like SSE. Next slide. Because Scim is actually a profile of HTTP, one of many HTTP features are HTTP respond async preferred requests as defined in RC 7240. If we were to support this feature, this would be one way Scim providers could signal request completion event results. This just seemed like a no-brainer to include, but I must confess, I don't have a strong use case, and I'm curious if anyone would have a use for this. Next slide. Okay, so this one is just showing an overall flow of how we could do asynchronous events. Next slide, please. So this is to the meat of the draft. The Scim event profile defines a number of common claims. JOTs use the term claims instead of attributes, by the way. Of concern for Scim are the following. TOE, the time of event. This is useful because as we consider how events are collected and arranged into streams, some time will pass. TOE allows SET to convey the time the actual event occurred as the Scim service provider, which may be earlier than the SET issuance time, which he's calling IETF. TOE is important because if events are received out of sequence, the TOE can be used to reorder events. TXN is a transaction identifier, which must be unique for each event that occurs in the Scim service. This value may be used to catch duplicate event messages that might occur depending on the delivery mechanism. Events, of course, is a claim kind of like Scim URIs. The events claim is a JSON structure carrying event URI attributes against which a JSON object can be attached. In the Scim event profile, each event URI contains the transaction details of the event. Inside an event schema object, we define 4 attributes for Scim: an ID, external ID, attributes, and data. ID and external ID are obvious. Attribute lists modified attributes when raw information is not to be shared, whereas data is used to pass the raw Scim request, e.g. for replication. Finally, in the current draft, I'm recommending that the JOT subclaim be the URI of the Scim resource that changed. In most cases, this gives the receiver quick access to do a Scim get to obtain more information. In many cases, the receiver need not parse any other information other than the event type URI. Next slide, please. Okay, subject identifiers. Before I show you what an event looks like, I'd like to talk about the SEC event subject identifiers draft. That's the draft that the SSE work uses, by the way. This draft defines many different types of identifiers that can be specified, like email, IP address, telephone, etc. This draft was spawned out of the OIDC world because of the way ID tokens were used. When an ID token was issued, the subject was not uniquely identified by the subclaim. It was always within the context of an ISS claim and the subclaim together. It turns out the ISS claim was doing double duty. It was both the issuer of the token and the issuer of the sub-value. This created problems for the OpenID clients that wanted to issue events. They needed to be able to specify the originating issuer for the sub, but the JOT spec is defined as the issuer of the JOT rather than the subject. In order to do this, the subject identifier spec came out. This spec has been in process for about 6 years and has been difficult to obtain consensus. That said, they seem to be getting close and are still in last call. In the case of Scim, I don't believe we have a subject identifier problem for a couple of reasons. Scim clearly defines the ID and external ID mechanism for this purpose. When resources are created, there is already agreement on common identifiers. 2, in the case where a Scim client has forgotten an ID, the event provides a Scim URI for the resource in the event. And 3rd, the event receiver can finally perform a Scim get to obtain any additional claim it needs to locate the corresponding local entity. I recommend against using the Scim subject identifier draft, as this would open up Scim receivers to having to process identifiers not typical of Scim. This optionality would decrease interoperability in order to align with a problem domain with unresolved standard agreements on identifiers. Next slide. So in this example, this is a typical event. In this case, a create event is being shown. Note that inside the events object, we define a common set of attributes. You've got the ID, external ID data and attributes. Typically in DBR cases, we show the actual transaction using the data attribute. This attribute corresponds to the original Scim request. When this event is done for coordinated provisioning, the data is not provided, and instead attributes is provided with a set of attributes issued. Note that the create event actually includes an ID, whereas the Scim create request does not. Why? Well, remember, set is an event that has already happened. So the Scim create event shows the ID that was actually assigned. Okay, next slide. In addition to repeating the Scim CRUD events, there are a few other events that are important. The feed events are about alerting a receiver about a new entity that they may not be aware of. This happens when the user population in one domain is a subset of another. For example, users provisioned to SFDC might be users in Azure that may have the role CRM. When Sally has the entitlement of CRM added, SFDC is alerted of that the Sally resource is now part of the feed. SFDC may need to first obtain the Sally resource in order to provision Sally into CRM, since no Sally create event will have been previously observed by Salesforce SFDC. In addition to the Scim create, put, patch, delete events, I've also added activate and deactivate events because different service providers may have different meanings regarding active and inactive, etc. A more generic event is defined so that publishers and receivers can better coordinate on activation. For now, I've only defined two risk-like signals, auth method change and password reset. We should keep talking about how we want to approach these events. These are different in that the audience of the event may not be a Scim system client or provider. Finally, as previously discussed, the async response event is also included. Next slide. In the event profile, I've described a couple different delivery mechanisms, in part because I felt it important to describe how events might be exchanged and how it might be managed. Looking at this, I saw two road categories for delivery: bus-based systems and point-to-point systems. Nancy, me, I've already spoken about the shared signals event framework and the set transfer specs, but the other I wanted to point out was message buses. Many companies may have large investments in message buses. In the Scim case, they're useful because you don't have to describe complex hierarchies of server interconnects that mandate master servers. All barriers to global infrastructures and scale. Instead, message buses become convenient for a number of reasons. A bus can implement infinite event recovery if desired. Each Scim server only connects to one bus rather than each other. The bus takes care of delivery, recovery, and fault tolerance. Having each server connect to one bus rather than each other dramatically simplifies configuration, credential management, and the number of event transfers. Finally, a bus can also act as an auditable record for changes in systems over time. Still, with all those benefits, when we go cross-domain, we want to control the flow through a limited set of connections or a gateway. In this case, SSC becomes advantageous. Next slide. So what's out of scope? Because events are statements of fact of what has occurred rather than commands, the spec doesn't prescribe what a receiver must or should do other than the message itself. The breakthrough of set is to avoid prescriptions and to focus on triggers or signals that enable independent action. Because there are many delivery systems, the spec will only talk about the basic mechanisms and any privacy and security considerations that flow from those systems. Thanks. Okay. I was slower than Phil, sorry. We have 5 minutes before we're done. We can take comments, questions. So Tim?
Tim Capelli, Microsoft, and just disclosure, I'm the chair of one of the chairs of the SSE working group. Can you go back one slide? I think the statement around commands, I think, is super important here, right? So when we look at SSE and what it's doing, it's a statement of fact that in the view of the transmitter, right? So my only concern here is to take a dependency on SSE in a protocol. Those are more commands than signals, right? You're in my opinion, at least the way I understand it, right? You are using this method to convey protocol operations versus observations by a single party, if that makes sense. So that's my only concern. I'm super happy to see SSE getting visibility here. That's just my only concern, right? Because that's been a super important distinction for SSE, at least as it's kind of positioned today. Doesn't mean it can't change, but.
All right, Leif Johansson. So I guess I'll echo that and also say that like the implementation complexity of this worries me a little bit. In like the way, if I were starting from a white sheet of paper, I would probably limit myself to just signaling that something has happened to a Scim resource and let the receiver figure out what to do with that information, whether it means resynchronizing the Scim resource or not. Sending along a lot of data with the event adds a whole bunch of complexity around stuff like idempotency and access control, and the security model is affected. There's so much complexity in this that I worry about the implementability. I would maybe like ask the working group to think about sort of whether this is actually needed or whether we can get away with a very, very simple event-based model for synchronization, just saying that something has happened and let the Scim client figure it out.
Okay. So I'm just going to echo Phil here from the chat, but I'm not sure, Tim, it might have been to your comment of that's why I anticipate DBR happening over buses versus cooperative or SSE.
Yeah, I guess I don't think you want two different. Scim is supposed to be very authoritative, correct? So I don't think you want two different pieces of Scim for the operation of the protocol. That one is do what you want and one is authoritative. Like that's concerning to me, right? If you're ultimately, yeah, I don't know. That again, I can be easily convinced. That was my first
It
reaction.
could be a question of clarifying the applicability and use case. Yep. Okay. Did he have questions that I didn't? Okay, so Phil actually had questions that I failed to go through. So in the interest of time, perhaps what we'll do is solicit more feedback over the mail list, and then we can talk about applicability and adoption at a later point based on the questions that Phil has posted. Okay, we have a minute and a half left. Any other orders of business, questions? We actually stayed on time. All right, thank you. Oh, one last logistics. Does the group want to continue with the every 4-week virtual for progress? Every 6 weeks? Yeah, I'm going to say every 6 weeks. Let me put a poll. Do you want to continue with an every 6-week virtual? If I could only type, that would be dangerous. Okay. Can you raise your hand if you want to continue with every 6 weeks? We'll have a virtual. How many participants do we have? Yeah, no, I was looking at this to see when. Yeah, we kind of have rough consensus. So I can put that on the mail list as well. And we can try and schedule a virtual for the next 6 weeks, and then we'll evaluate after that. All right. With that, I thank you for joining and participating, and we are right on time. Thanks, everyone. Oh, no, the mic stays alive. Yeah, it was funny. 'Cause you kept going, bring the mic closer, but then I would watch and it's like, because I was watching the chat and they're like, there's an echo. Nancy, you need to move away from the mic. Oh. Okay, one of them said 5 million. Hey, so I actually think doing, maybe I need to read it's the notion of, hey, you need to synchronize using Scim.
Right.
Are you sure? SSE.